The world of the British monarchy is often seen through a lens of stoicism, gold-braided uniforms, and an unbreakable sense of duty that masks the human heart. But just 5 minutes ago, a report emerged from within the private walls of Adelaide Cottage that has shattered that carefully maintained image. It wasn't a public decree or a grand announcement from a balcony. Instead, it was a quiet, private choice, made by Princess Catherine, a decision so profound and so deeply personal that it reportedly left Prince William, the future king, in a state of visible, raw emotion. Staff members, accustomed to the prince's typical composure, were left stunned as they witnessed a rare moment of vulnerability that proves, behind the titles and the palaces, there is a family grappling with a weight that most of us can barely imagine. What could Princess Catherine possibly decide that would bring a man like William to tears? To understand this, we must look at the atmosphere in the weeks leading up to this moment. Since her diagnosis and the subsequent road to recovery, Catherine has been more than just a patient. She has been the silent architect of her family's emotional survival. But as the pressure of the crown began to mount once again, with the world demanding her return to the spotlight, Catherine realized that something had to give. She looked at her children, she looked at the man who has stood by her through every dark hour, and she made a choice that defies centuries of royal expectation. This is not just a story about a princess, it is a story about the cost of a crown and the silent sacrifices made in the name of love and health. The scene at the cottage was described by those close to the family as one of profound stillness. The winter air outside was cold, but inside, the tension was palpable. For months, William has carried the weight of the entire institution on his shoulders, while Catherine focused on healing. He has been the protector, the public face, and the pillar of strength. But even the strongest pillars can crack under the immense pressure of seeing the person they love most suffering in silence. Catherine's choice, made in the quiet of their living room, was a moment of absolute clarity. It was a choice that prioritized the human over the royal, the mother over the monarch, and the wife over the public figure. When she spoke the words, the room reportedly went silent, and for the first time in a very long time, the future king allowed the mask to drop completely. For those of us watching from the outside, we often forget that every public appearance is a performance, a duty fulfilled at a high personal cost. We see the smiles and the elegant coats, but we don't see the exhaustion in their eyes or the way their hands might shake when the cameras are turned off. This morning, however, the performance stopped. Catherine's private choice has sent shockwaves through the palace because it challenges the very idea that duty must always come before self. It is a decision that reflects a new era of the monarchy, one that values mental well-being and family stability over outdated protocols. But as the news travels through the corridors of Kensington Palace and beyond, everyone is asking the same question. What does this mean for the future, and how will the institution survive when its brightest star decides to dim her light for the sake of her soul? William's tears were not just of sadness. They were reported to be tears of immense relief, mixed with the overwhelming realization of what his wife has been carrying. He has watched her fight a battle no one should have to fight in the public eye. He has seen the toll it has taken on her physical and emotional state. When she revealed her choice, a decision to fundamentally alter her role and her presence for the foreseeable future, it was as if a heavy shroud had been lifted, revealing the stark, painful truth underneath. The entire palace is now in a state of quiet reflection, realizing that the business-as-usual approach is no longer sustainable. This is the moment everything changed, not through a war or a scandal, but through a quiet choice made by a woman who refused to be broken by the expectations of the world. To truly understand why this moment shattered Prince William's composure, we have to look back at the weeks of invisible tension that preceded that fateful evening at Adelaide Cottage. For months, the Princess of Wales has been living in a state of dual existence, one that the public rarely sees. On the surface, she is the epitome of grace, the future queen who reassures a nation with a single video or a carefully timed photograph. But behind those closed doors, Catherine has been navigating a psychological landscape far more treacherous than any royal tour. She has been dealing with what experts call royal hypervigilance, the constant, exhausting awareness of being watched, judged, and measured, even while fighting the most private battle for her health. It was this realization, the sheer weight of this performance, that led her to the choice she revealed just 5 minutes ago. The days leading up to Sunday were marked by a subtle but profound shift in Catherine's demeanor. William, who has spent 20 years learning to read his wife's every unspoken thought, noticed it first. He saw the way her gaze lingered a little too long on the children as they played on the lawn, a look of fierce protection mixed with a haunting sadness. He noticed the way she began to withdraw from the endless discussions about the return, the strategic planning sessions held by palace aides regarding her autumn and winter schedule. While the institution was busy calculating her value to the monarchy's public image, Catherine was calculating the cost to her soul. She realized that the mask she had worn so perfectly for so long was no longer a tool of duty, but a cage that was preventing her from truly healing. William himself has been living in his own private hell, caught between his ancient oath to the crown and his sacred vow to the woman he loves. He has been the one carrying the briefing red boxes, the one attending the state dinners, and the one smiling for the cameras while his heart was miles away at her bedside. The staff at Kensington Palace have whispered about the eerie silence that often follows the prince after a long day of engagements. He would return home, not to the grand halls of a palace, but to the modest confines of the cottage, where he would find Catherine sitting in the dim light, lost in thought. The pressure on him to be both the future king and the primary caregiver has been immense, and it has aged him in ways that the public has only just begun to notice. The private choice Catherine made was born from a moment of raw honesty that occurred during a sleepless night earlier that week. She looked at the man who has been her rock and realized that her attempts to protect him and the children by performing strength were actually creating a deeper fracture. She saw that the children, George, Charlotte, and especially young Louis, were absorbing the unspoken stress, learning to suffer in silence just as she had. This was her breaking point. She realized that by continuing to prioritize the institutional needs over her family's emotional reality, she was repeating the very cycles of trauma that had broken previous royal women. Her decision was a radical act of self-preservation, not just for herself, but for the entire future of the Wales family. When Catherine finally sat William down to reveal her decision, she didn't speak as a princess. She spoke as a mother who had looked into the abyss and decided she would not let it swallow her family. She told him that the old way was over. The choice she made involves a fundamental restructuring of their lives, a withdrawal from the performative aspects of royal life that the palace machine considers non-negotiable. It was the clarity and the finality in her voice that eventually broke William. For the first time, he realized he didn't have to be the sole protector. She was protecting them both by choosing the truth over the tradition. As the realization of what this means for their future set in, the tears that fell were a testament to a love that is finally refusing to pay the price of a crown. The choice Catherine revealed was not a sudden whim. It was a carefully structured rebellion against a system that has long prioritized the institution over the individual. Inside the wood-paneled rooms of the palace, the gray suits, the senior advisors, who have governed royal lives for decades, were already sensing a shift. For years, the monarchy has survived on a diet of silence and stoicism. Never complain, never explain, was the mantra that built the crown. But Catherine has realized that this very mantra is what almost destroyed those she loves. Her private choice involves a radical withdrawal from the royal rotary, the relentless cycle of garden parties and symbolic appearances that define a working royal's life. To the palace machine, this is a crisis of optics. To Catherine, it is a matter of life and death. William, as he sat there, could see the physical toll the decision took on her. In the soft light of the cottage, the fine lines around Catherine's eyes were more than just signs of age. They were maps of the sleepless nights spent worrying about her children's future. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, a physical manifestation of the internal war between duty and survival. It is here that we see the application of a profound truth. The body keeps the score. Catherine's physical signs, the unusual paleness of her skin, and the way she carried her shoulders with a defensive hunch, told a story of a woman who had reached her absolute limit. She was no longer willing to trade her health for a headline. And William, seeing these signs clearly for the first time without the lens of duty, realized he could no longer ask her to. The palace machine, however, does not easily accept no. There were already whispers of emergency meetings being held at Buckingham Palace. Advisors were reportedly arguing that the monarchy cannot survive if its most popular member retreats from the public eye. They fear a void that cannot be filled. But Catherine's choice is a direct challenge to this fear. She is asserting that a healthy, present mother and a stable family are far more valuable to the future of the crown than 1,000 public appearances made behind a mask of exhaustion. This clash between the modern need for human authenticity and the ancient demand for royal performance is reaching a breaking point. William's tears were for the realization that his life's work protecting the monarchy might actually be at odds with protecting his wife. What makes this choice so devastating to the institutional status quo is that it empowers others. By choosing her private well-being, Catherine is giving permission to the rest of the family to acknowledge their own pain. George, at 12, is already being prepared for the weight of the scepter. Catherine's choice ensures that he will not have to inherit a life of performative perfection. She is breaking the cycle. As the news trickles down to the household staff, the atmosphere is one of hushed respect. They have seen the reality of her struggle. They have seen the lights burning late in her rooms. They understand that this private choice is the only way forward, even if it leaves the future of the monarchy looking vastly different than anyone ever expected. The most devastating layer of Catherine's private choice, the one that finally broke William's heart into pieces, was her focus on the invisible price their children were paying. For years, the world has looked at Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis as symbols of a bright, modern future for the crown. We see them waving on the balcony, dressed in coordinated outfits, the picture of perfect royal upbringing. But Catherine, with the sharpened intuition of a mother who has faced her own mortality, began to see a different story. She realized that the palace machine was already beginning to mold them into miniature performers. She noticed how 9-year-old Charlotte would instinctively check for cameras before she smiled, or how George, at only 12, carried a tension in his jaw that mirrored his father's own heavy burden of duty. Catherine's choice was a vow of privacy so radical it challenged every precedent set by the late Queen and King Charles. She told William that she would no longer allow their children to be used as emotional anchors for the public's perception of the monarchy. Her decision was to effectively withdraw George, Charlotte, and Louis from the public eye almost entirely until they reached adulthood. No more staged birthday portraits if they weren't feeling up to it. No more forced appearances at state events to soften the image of the crown. She looked at William and said, "I will not let them grow up pretending to be happy for the sake of a headline." This hit William with the force of a tidal wave, because he recognized his own haunted childhood. In her words, the trauma of being a child who had to perform grief in front of a global audience. William's tears were a manifestation of suppressed memories and the overwhelming guilt of a father who realized he was accidentally leading his children down the same path of silent suffering that had defined his own youth. Catherine pointed out the physical signs she had been observing, the way George would go still when he heard a helicopter, or how Louis would become overexcited as a defense mechanism against the stifling formality of palace life. She used the language of the heart to explain that their children were developing a public self and a private self at far too young an age. This psychological split is the root of so much royal tragedy, and Catherine's choice was to cauterize that wound before it could grow. The institutional pushback to this part of the choice has been immediate and fierce. Senior courtiers have argued that the public needs to see the children to feel connected to the future of the monarchy. But Catherine remained unmoved. She argued that the monarchy's future depends on having a king and a royal family that are mentally whole, not hollowed out by a lifetime of performative duty. She chose to be a shield for her children, even if that shield drew the fire of the press and the disapproval of traditionalists. William, looking at the woman who was willing to defy an entire system to save their children's childhood, felt a surge of respect so deep it became unbearable. He realized that while he was trained to protect the crown, Catherine was born to protect the bloodline not as a political entity, but as a living, breathing family. This part of the private choice creates a total blackout on the children's lives, a move that hasn't been seen in the digital age of the monarchy. It is a decision that forces the public to confront their own role in the pressure placed upon these young lives. Catherine is effectively saying that the public's right to know ends at the doorstep of her children's well-being. As William sat in that quiet room, the weight of his ancestors seemed to clash with the truth of his wife's words. The tears he shed were for the childhood he lost, and for the promise that, because of Catherine's courage, his children would not have to lose theirs. The palace machine may be stunned, but for the first time in centuries, the heart of the family is beating louder than the demands of the state. As the gravity of Catherine's decision settled over Adelaide Cottage, the ripple effect began to move outward, reaching the cold, grey corridors of Buckingham Palace, where tradition is guarded like a sacred fire. This is the moment where the private choice becomes an institutional earthquake. For decades, the monarchy has operated on the assumption that its members are not merely people, but symbols, vessels for the public's expectations. But Catherine, in her quiet, steady voice, has effectively declared that the vessel is full to the point of breaking. She confronted the grey suits, the senior advisors who managed the royal narrative, with a truth they were not prepared to hear. She told them that the era of the perfect, plastic princess is over. She is no longer willing to be a character in a national soap opera, while her real life, her real health, and her real family hang in the balance. The psychological weight of this institutional rebellion is what truly left William in tears. He has spent his entire life watching the women in his family be consumed by the demands of the crown. He watched his mother, Diana, struggle for breath under the suffocating weight of public scrutiny and palace indifference. He watched the late Queen sacrifice almost every personal impulse to the altar of duty. For years, William has been subconsciously terrified that the same fate was waiting for Catherine. When she stood her ground, refusing to participate in the autumn relaunch of her public image until she felt mentally and physically whole, it was as if she was reaching back through time and healing a wound that has existed in William's heart since he was 15 years old. Her choice to say no was the greatest gift she could have ever given him, the gift of his wife's survival over the crown's convenience. The advisors, reportedly, were stunned by her lack of compromise. They spoke of public duty and the national interest, using the same coded language that has been used to silence royal struggle for centuries. But Catherine's choice was framed through the lens of modern survival. She pointed to the physical signs of her exhaustion that the public ignores: the thinning of her hair, the way her voice falters when she has to speak of resilience, and the deep, dark circles she covers with expensive makeup every time she has to face a camera. She asked them a haunting question: what is the value of the monarchy if it requires the slow destruction of the people within it? This question represents a fundamental shift in the royal contract. She is demanding a human-first monarchy, and William, caught between his training and his heart, has finally chosen his heart. William's emotional breakdown was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of a profound, spiritual release. He realized that for the first time in the history of the House of Windsor, a senior royal woman was not asking for permission to be human. She was taking it. The tears he shed were for the immense pride he felt in her courage, and for the sudden, startling realization that he no longer had to play the part of the silent protector of a failing system. He could just be William. The cottage, which has often felt like a bunker against the world's noise, suddenly felt like a sanctuary of truth. Catherine's private choice is not an act of desertion, it is an act of leadership. She is leading the monarchy out of the dark ages of stoic suffering and into a new era of authentic vulnerability. As the news of this confrontation began to leak to the highest levels of the palace hierarchy, the air became thick with a sense of impending change. The choice involves a complete rewrite of the Princess of Wales's role, one that prioritizes recovery, family, and private meaning over the hollow rituals of state. It is a decision that forces the public to look past the tiara and see the person underneath. Catherine has stopped being a royal asset and has started being a royal architect, designing a life that is sustainable and real. William, holding her hand in the aftermath of their revelation, realized that the tears on his face were the first honest thing he had felt in years. The mask has been dropped, and while the palace may be in shock, the man who will one day wear the crown has never been more certain of the woman standing by his side. The morning after Catherine revealed her private choice, a strange and heavy stillness descended upon Adelaide Cottage, a stark contrast to the frantic energy erupting within the communication offices of Buckingham Palace. While aides were reportedly scrambling to draft neutralizing statements, Catherine was busy implementing what she calls her sanctuary protocol. This choice is not a temporary leave of absence. It is a permanent restructuring of how a future queen consort occupies her space. She has decided to dismantle the red box lifestyle, the endless stream of paperwork, constitutional briefings, and administrative obligations that have long bled into her private hours. She told William that from now on, her home would no longer be an annex of the state. It would be a place where the crown is left at the doorstep. This specific detail of her choice, the total separation of home and throne, is what brought a fresh wave of emotion to Prince William. For his entire life, William has known no boundary. He grew up in palaces where the staff were constant shadows and where his mother's private tears were often witnessed by equerries and secretaries. He has spent his adulthood trying to build a wall between his family and the world. But Catherine's choice has finally built that wall from the inside out. She has mandated a reduced staff environment, choosing to handle the domestic rhythms of her children's lives herself, even in her recovery. She told William, "I would rather have a simple life with you than a grand life for them," referring to the public. Seeing his wife prioritize the mundane beauty of their shared life over the magnificent burden of her title was a moment of profound spiritual clarity for the prince. Physically, the change in Catherine was immediate, and it was this visual transformation that left William struggling to maintain his composure. The royal mask, that tight, controlled expression of pleasant neutrality, had vanished. In its place was a woman who looked tired, yes, but also immensely settled. Her choice to stop the preventative performance of health allowed her true self to emerge. William noticed that for the first time in months, her breathing was deep and rhythmic, no longer the shallow, guarded breaths of someone waiting for the next crisis. This is the human-first approach in action. Catherine is teaching the future king that true power does not come from the ability to endure suffering in silence, but from the courage to protect one's peace at all costs. However, outside their sanctuary, the gray suits are reportedly in a state of near paralysis. Catherine's choice to opt out of the royal Christmas choreography and the traditional New Year's re-emergence plan has left the monarchy's public relations strategy in tatters. They are realizing that Catherine is not just a member of the team, she is the soul of the modern monarchy. Without her participation in the performative rituals, the institution feels hollow, a collection of gold and stone without a heartbeat. But Catherine's choice is intended to highlight exactly that. She wants the public to realize that if the monarchy requires the sacrifice of a woman's soul to function, then the monarchy itself must change. William's tears were a mix of grief for the institution he was born to lead and an overwhelming, fierce loyalty to the woman who is forcing it to evolve. As the sun rose over Windsor that Tuesday, the reality of their new life began to take shape. The private choice means fewer cameras, fewer tiaras, and fewer headlines, but more laughter, more presence, and a genuine chance at a full recovery. Catherine has effectively reset the royal clock. She told William that she is no longer interested in being the most popular royal. She only wants to be the most present mother and the most authentic wife. For a man who has lost so much to the demands of the crown, hearing those words was like being given his life back. The palace may be stunned, and the world may be confused, but inside the walls of Adelaide Cottage, the future King of England is finally learning what it means to be truly home. The scene of this historic confrontation shifted from the intimate warmth of Adelaide Cottage to the cold, echoing grandeur of Windsor Castle on Thursday, December 5th. This was the meeting the palace had been dreading, the moment when the private choice met the immovable object of the sovereign's will. As William and Catherine entered the king's private study, the air was thick with the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. King Charles, a man who has spent 70 years preparing for a role that demands the absolute suppression of the self, sat behind a desk laden with state papers. But as Catherine began to speak, revealing the full extent of her withdrawal and her plan to shield the children, the king's expression reportedly shifted from professional concern to a profound, aching sadness. This was the moment where the sovereign collided with the grandfather. Catherine did not use the language of constitutional duty. She used the language of the human heart. She described the intergenerational trauma that has haunted the House of Windsor, the silent suffering of children raised as symbols, and the slow erosion of the women who married into the institution. She looked at Charles and spoke of the physical toll she had witnessed in him, too, the way his own hands, often swollen and tired, were symbols of a life spent in service at the cost of his own peace. By using these physical maps of duty, she forced the king to confront his own suppressed pain. William, standing by her side, watched his father's face and felt a wave of emotion so strong he had to turn away. He was seeing a king realize that his life's work might have been built on a foundation of human sacrifice that his grandchildren could no longer afford to pay. The king's reaction was not one of anger, but of a heavy, reflective silence that lasted for what felt like an eternity. He looked at Catherine, a woman he has often described as his beloved daughter-in-law, and he saw not a princess, but a survivor. He realized that the choice she was presenting was not a negotiation. It was a boundary. She was effectively telling the king that the monarchy must evolve, or it will break the people it relies upon. Charles, who has spent his life trying to balance the old world with the new, seemed to grasp in that moment that Catherine's rebellion was the only thing that might actually save the crown in the 21st century. William's tears in this moment were for the bridge being built between him and his father, a bridge of shared understanding that duty does not have to mean the destruction of the soul. However, the institutional implications discussed in that room were staggering. The sanctuary protocol means that the royal family's brand, so heavily dependent on the image of the perfect family, would have to be completely reinvented. Catherine proposed a model where public service is distinct from private life, a separation of powers between the person and the position. The king reportedly struggled with this, fearing the public's reaction to a less visible monarchy. But Catherine's counter-argument was chillingly effective. A visible monarchy that is hollowed out by grief will not survive the next generation. This was the next-level strategy in action, prioritizing long-term institutional health over short-term public relations. As the meeting concluded, the king did something unprecedented. He reached out and took Catherine's hand, a silent acknowledgement that the private choice was, in fact, the only choice. The moment William and Catherine stepped out of the king's study at Windsor, the air felt different. The private choice was no longer a theory or a desperate plea. It was now the official, albeit secret, policy of the Wales household, sanctioned by the sovereign himself. But as they walked through the long, portrait-lined galleries, William felt a surge of emotion that surpassed even the tension of the meeting. He looked at the faces of his ancestors, staring down from the walls men and women who had lived and died by the sword of duty, often at the expense of their own hearts. For the first time in his life, William didn't feel like a prisoner of those gilded frames. He felt like the man who had finally broken the glass. The immediate aftermath involved a clinical, almost surgical restructuring of their communication strategy. The sanctuary protocol was put into high gear. Catherine's private secretary was reportedly given strict instructions: no more leaking of health updates to appease the tabloids, no more negotiating for just one photo to prove she was recovering. The choice was total. Catherine had decided that her recovery would happen in the dark, away from the artificial light of public expectation. She told the senior aides, "If the public loves the monarchy, they will wait for it to be healthy. If they only love the spectacle, then the spectacle is over." This uncompromising stance is what has left the gray suits in a state of stunned silence. They are used to a family that bargains for its privacy, They are not used to a family that simply takes it. William's tears in the car ride back to Adelaide Cottage were described as a cleansing flood. He was mourning the years he spent trying to satisfy a machine that is never satisfied. And he was celebrating the fact that his wife had saved him from a lifetime of the same. He looked at Catherine and saw a strength that was quiet, feminine, and utterly immovable. She had done what no advisor, no politician, and no king had been able to do. She had humanized the crown. By choosing to be just Catherine, she had ensured that she could eventually be a much better queen. William realized that his role had shifted from being the defender of the institution to the defender of the sanctuary. The relief was so absolute that it manifested as a physical exhaustion, a letting go of a tension he had carried since his mother's funeral. But the world outside was already beginning to sense the great silence. As scheduled appearances were quietly removed from the royal calendar and the usual source-led stories dried up, a vacuum of information began to grow. This is the danger zone of the private choice, the moment where the press tries to fill the silence with speculation. But Catherine had anticipated this. She chose to let the silence be her message. She is teaching a lesson in boundaries to a world that has forgotten they exist. As William watched her sit with the children that evening, reading a story as if the weight of 1,000 years wasn't resting on her shoulders, he understood that the choice wasn't just about her. It was a blueprint for their survival. The monarchy had just survived its greatest internal challenge, not with a decree, but with a quiet, firm no. As the weeks passed following the private choice, a phenomenon began to occur that the British monarchy had not witnessed since the days of the Blitz, a total, impenetrable, and dignified institutional silence. The sanctuary protocol was now fully operational, and for the first time in modern history, the hunger of the 24-hour news cycle was met with a famine of information. The public, especially those across the Atlantic who have watched Catherine's journey with a mixture of admiration and concern, began to realize that the spectacle had truly ended. But inside the gates of Adelaide Cottage, this silence was not hollow. It was a fertile ground for a new kind of royal life to take root. Catherine's decision to be unseen was proving to be her most powerful act of leadership yet. It was a silent strike against the commodification of her personhood. The psychological shift within the household was most evident in the children, and it was this transformation that kept William in a state of perpetual, grateful emotion. He described to a close friend that the rewilding of his children's souls had begun. George, no longer anticipating the flash of a camera at every school event, had started to regain a sense of carefree curiosity. Charlotte, freed from the burden of being the miniature princess, was thriving in her newfound anonymity. But it was young Louis, the one most sensitive to the unspoken tensions of his parents, who showed the greatest change. He no longer felt the need to perform cheerfulness to mask the family's pain. Catherine's choice had effectively lowered the emotional volume of their lives, allowing the natural rhythms of childhood to return. For William, watching his children breathe without the weight of the crown on their chests was the ultimate validation of Catherine's sacrifice. However, the silence was not without its critics. Behind the scenes, the media industry was in a state of quiet panic. A monarchy that doesn't provide content is a monarchy that cannot be monetized. There were reported attempts to bait the family into a response, unfounded rumors, and think pieces questioning the stability of the institution. But Catherine had prepared William for this. She told him, "Their noise is a sign of their loss of control. Our silence is a sign of our freedom. This is the core of the human-first strategy." By refusing to engage, they were starving the beast of public scrutiny. The prince, who spent years reacting to every tabloid headline, finally learned the power of the great refusal. He realized that the only people he owed a performance to were the 4 people sitting around his dinner table. William's tears during these quiet winter evenings were no longer tears of pain, but of a profound, spiritual homecoming. He looked at the woman who had defied 1,000 years of the way things are done and realized she had saved more than just herself. She had saved the future of the House of Windsor by making it human again. Catherine's private choice has forced a global conversation about the limits of public service and the sanctity of private suffering. She has demonstrated that a princess can be most effective when she is most private, providing a moral compass for a world that is increasingly obsessed with being seen. As the Kitschbahn moves toward its final conclusion, one truth remains. The monarchy will never be the same, and for the man who will one day lead it, that is the greatest relief of all. As the final days of 2025 approached, the world stood at a crossroads of understanding. The private choice made by Princess Catherine in the quiet corners of Adelaide Cottage had reached its ultimate conclusion. On Christmas morning, for the first time in modern memory, the long walk to St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham did not feature the most photographed woman in the world. There were no designer coats to dissect, no elegant waves to analyze, and no performative smiles to broadcast. Instead, there was only the crisp Norfolk air and the sound of bells. But the silence where Catherine's presence used to be was not an absence, it was a profound, resonant statement. The public, initially confused and even frustrated by the lack of access, began to undergo a collective transformation. They realized that by letting Catherine go, they were allowing her to survive. The sanctuary protocol had successfully redefined the relationship between the people and the crown. The final emotional resolution for Prince William occurred on a quiet evening by the fireplace, just 5 minutes ago, in the timeline of this family's long recovery. He looked at Catherine, who was no longer the Princess of Wales in that moment, but simply his wife. For the first time in years, the royal hypervigilance that had haunted her eyes had been replaced by a genuine, settled peace. She was no longer a person whose value was determined by her visibility. Her choice to prioritize her private soul over her public role had not weakened the monarchy. It had given it a conscience. William realized that his tears, those frequent, heavy tears of the past weeks, had finally dried, leaving behind a clarity he hadn't known since childhood. He was the future king, yes, but he was now a king who knew that the strength of his reign would be measured by the health of his home, not the perfection of his palace. The legacy of this moment will be felt for generations. Princess Charlotte, Prince George, and Prince Louis are the first royal children in history to be raised with the right to be human. Catherine's choice has ensured that they will not enter adulthood as hollow shells of public expectation, but as individuals with a fortified sense of self. The palace machine, once so resistant to this change, has been forced to adapt to a new reality. The public now demands authenticity over artifice. The private choice has become a public standard. As the camera pans away from the quiet cottage and back to the grand palaces, we are left with a final, hauntingly beautiful truth. A crown is only as strong as the person wearing it, and Catherine has chosen to make sure that person is whole. This concludes the most significant chapter in the modern history of the British monarchy. It is a story that began with a diagnosis and ended with a revolution of the heart. Prince William, a man who once feared he would lose everything to the crown, has discovered that by supporting his wife's private choice, he has actually saved everything that truly matters. The entire palace may have been stunned, and the corridors of power may have been shaken, but as the lights dim on this extraordinary year, the House of Windsor is no longer just an institution. Thanks to the courage of one woman, it is finally a family again.